In the summer of 1992, on the edge of a small town called Briar Creek in Oakridge County, a widow named Margaret Calder walked her cherry orchard every morning before the heat came up, the way she had walked it for 30 years, first beside her husband Thomas and now alone. Thomas had been gone 4 seasons by then, and the orchard had not once gone untended in all that time, because Maggie had never learned it from a book or a notebook left behind. She had learned it the slow way, the only way that ever really sticks, by standing under the same tree season after season with a man who noticed everything and said little, until noticing became a habit she carried on her own after he was buried on the hill above the north block. The orchard was 11 acres of sour cherries, the tart kind that Midwest growers had leaned on for generations because the trees were hardy enough for the winters and the fruit sold well to canneries and pie companies across 3 counties, and because a good stand of cherries, cared for properly, could carry a small family through years when other crops failed. The orchard itself had come down through Thomas's family, planted originally by his father in the years just after the war, when a returning soldier with a little land and less money had chosen sour cherries over apples because the trees bore sooner and asked less of a thin, sandy soil that hadn't wanted much else. Thomas grew up climbing those same trees, and when Maggie married into the family at 22, she learned the orchard the way a person learns a second language living inside it, slowly, by mistake and correction, until the vocabulary of pruning cuts and bloom timing and rain patterns became as natural to her as her own name. Neighbors in Briar Creek sometimes remarked, kindly, that Maggie had become more of a cherry grower than half the men who'd been born to it, and she took the comment as the compliment it was meant to be, though she always credited Thomas, who had a habit of pointing at something ordinary in the orchard, a leaf, a limb, a patch of shade, and turning it into a lesson without ever seeming to lecture. In the 4 years since he had passed, she had kept the orchard exactly the size it was rather than expanded or sell off a piece as some widows in her position might have, partly out of practicality and partly, she admitted to herself some mornings, because working 11 acres alone kept her close enough to the trees that she still felt him in the rows sometimes, especially in June, which had always been his favorite month on the place. That June, the trees were carrying the heaviest bloom set Maggie had seen in years, branches bowed low with fruit just beginning to blush from green to red, and for 2 weeks the weather had been kind, dry and warm, the kind of stretch that let a grower breathe easy. Then the forecast changed. The radio out of the county seat carried the warning 3 days running, a slow-moving band of humid air pushing up from the south, expected to sit over Oakridge County for the better part of 2 weeks, bringing intermittent rain, heavy dew, and air so thick with moisture that laundry would not dry on the line. For most crops, that kind of weather was only an inconvenience. For a cherry orchard heavy with ripening fruit, it was something closer to a countdown, because everyone who had grown cherries in that part of the Midwest for more than a few seasons knew what humid, wet weeks could do in the final stretch before harvest. The fungus that caused brown rot in stone fruit did not need much of an invitation. It lived quietly in old mummified fruit left on the ground or hanging in the trees from the year before, waiting for warm, wet conditions to wake it, and once it woke, it spread on the wind and the rain from blossom to twig to ripening fruit, turning firm cherries to soft brown collapse within days if the conditions held. A grower could lose a third of a crop, sometimes more, in the space of a single wet week if the fruit stayed damp too long and the canopy stayed too close and shaded for the moisture to lift. Maggie knew this the way she knew the creak of her own porch steps. She had lived through wet Junes before, some kind to her, some cruel, and she had come to trust a particular rhythm for getting through them, one that had nothing to do with chemicals and everything to do with air. The cooperative that bought most of the county's cherries, the Prairie Star Growers Cooperative, paid a premium for clean, unblemished fruit destined for the fresh market and a much lower price for fruit with any sign of rot, which the cooperative diverted to juice and low-grade processing at a fraction of the return. For a small operation like Maggie's, the difference between a fresh market check and a juice-grade check was the difference between a comfortable winter and a lean one. Word of the coming wet spell moved through Briar Creek fast, the way weather news always did among growers who depended on the sky for their living. And within a day most of the larger orchards in the area had already made their move. David Reese, who ran nearly 40 acres of cherries 2 farms over from Maggie's place and served that year as the head of the local Growers Association, had a spray contractor booked before the second radio warning even finished, a truck fitted with an air blast sprayer scheduled to run fungicide through his whole orchard twice before the rain settled in. David was not a cruel man, and he did not dislike Maggie, but he had strong opinions about doing things the way the co-op's own newsletter recommended, and he made no secret of them when he stopped his truck at the end of Maggie's lane on his way back from the feed store. He told her, plainly, that with weather like this coming, anyone who skipped a fungicide pass was gambling with a whole season's income, and he said it kindly enough, the way a person warns a neighbor about black ice on the road. When Maggie told him she wasn't planning to spray at all, that she meant to spend the coming days pruning instead, thinning the canopy, and clearing every scrap of fallen or spoiled fruit off the orchard floor, David laughed, not unkindly, but genuinely surprised, and said that cutting branches wasn't going to stop a fungus that traveled on rain and wind. He wasn't the only one who thought so. At the feed store 2 days later, when Maggie stopped in for wire and twine, a couple of the other growers who'd heard about her plan through David needled her lightly about it. One of them joking that she might as well go out and ask the clouds nicely to skip her acreage, and the laughter, though good-natured, followed her out to her truck and sat with her the whole drive home. The owner of the feed store himself, a heavy-set, good-humored man named Otis who had sold Maggie wire and nails and seed for 20 years, leaned over the counter and asked, mostly in fun, whether she wanted him to throw in a rain slicker with her order, since it sounded like she'd be spending the whole wet spell up in the trees rather than down at the co-op picking up spray, and the small line of customers behind her chuckled along, not cruelly, but in the easy way small-town gatherings laughed at anything that broke from the expected pattern. One of the younger growers, a man who'd taken over his uncle's orchard only 2 seasons earlier and still leaned hard on whatever the co-op newsletter recommended, said he couldn't imagine betting a whole crop on pruning shears when a fungicide truck was 1 phone call away, and though he meant no harm by it, the comment landed with a little more weight than the others, because Maggie understood exactly how it must have looked to a younger grower with no memory of the seasons she and Thomas had spent learning the hard way. She did not begrudge them the laugh. She understood exactly why it looked foolish from the outside. A widow alone on 11 acres choosing pruning shears over a chemical she could not afford anyway, and she knew that from where David and the others stood, thinning branches while a threat like brown rot bore down looked less like a plan and more like giving up. But Maggie had not arrived at her plan out of stubbornness or pride, and she had certainly not arrived at it that week. It went back years, to wet Junes she and Thomas had weathered together long before David Reese ever took over his family's acreage. She remembered, plainly, the seasons when they had sprayed on schedule same as everyone else, and still watched rot take hold worst in the trees at the center of their oldest block, the ones planted too close together decades earlier, their canopies grown thick and tangled until sunlight barely reached the lower limbs. Those trees stayed wet longest after every rain, sometimes holding dew on their lower leaves and fruit clusters well past noon, while the outer rows, more open to sun and wind, had dried by mid-morning. Thomas had noticed it first, one wet August years before he passed, walking the rows with his hand brushing damp leaves at 10 in the morning in the dense block and dry ones 20 feet away in a more open row, and he'd said something Maggie never forgot, that the fungus wasn't really fighting the spray so much as it was living off the water that lingered where the air couldn't move. From that season on, they had made a habit, every year regardless of whether they sprayed, of opening the canopy properly each winter and again with a lighter pass in early summer if the trees pushed too much new growth, cutting out the thin whip-like water sprouts that shot straight up through the center of the tree and did nothing but crowd the middle and hold moisture, and cutting out limbs that crossed and rubbed and blocked light from reaching the lower fruit. They had also made a habit, one Maggie kept faithfully after he was gone, of walking the orchard floor after every rain and every windstorm to pick up anything that had fallen, because a single rotted cherry left lying in the grass carried enough fungal spores inside it to seed an entire row come the next wet spell, and leaving mummified fruit hanging on the branches through winter was, as Thomas used to put it, like leaving the door unlocked on purpose. None of it was a secret, exactly, and none of it was unique to Maggie or to Thomas before her. It was the kind of thing county extension agents had written about for years in bulletins most growers skimmed and set aside. The kind of practical, unglamorous farm knowledge that didn't sell equipment or make headlines. Easy to know and easier still to neglect when a chemical solution promised something faster and more certain. But Maggie had never neglected it, because she had watched it work with her own eyes across enough seasons to trust it the way she trusted the changing color of the sky before a storm. So while David's contractor ran the air blast sprayer through his 40 acres twice that week, and while several of the smaller growers around Briar Creek scrambled to book what spray time they could get on short notice, Maggie spent 3 long days up on a ladder and down on her knees, working her way row by row through the orchard with a pair of loppers and a handsaw, cutting out water sprouts, opening gaps in the canopy where limbs had grown too close, and hauling every scrap of prunings and every piece of fallen or spotted fruit to a burn pile well clear of the trees. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that left her hands blistered and her back aching by the second evening. And more than once, resting in the shade with a jar of water, she found herself wondering whether the wet weather would simply overwhelm the whole effort regardless, whether 30 years of noticing had taught her something true or only something that had happened to work by chance in seasons past. More than once during those 3 days, standing at the base of a ladder with her shoulders aching, she caught herself talking half out loud to Thomas the way she sometimes did when a task grew hard enough to need company, telling him she hoped he was right about the trees drying faster, and telling herself, in the next breath, that hoping a dead man was right about airflow was a strange way to spend a June afternoon, though it steadied her all the same. She did not let the doubt stop her hands, though. She kept at the pruning through the 3rd day, finishing the last of the oldest block just as the first gray clouds rolled in low over the ridge to the west. And that evening, standing at the edge of the orchard watching the sky darken early, she allowed herself to admit that whatever came next was mostly out of her control now, and that patience, not more work, was what the coming days would ask of her. The rain began that night and settled in as the forecast had promised, not a hard, driving storm but a slow, gray soak, a drizzle that came and went and left the whole county wrapped in a damp haze that didn't fully lift even on the hours it wasn't actively raining. For 9 days the pattern held, rain overnight or in the early morning, heavy air through the afternoons, the sun breaking through only in short, teasing intervals. Maggie kept to her own rhythm through it, walking her rows each morning in a slicker with a bucket, checking for any early sign of rot, and pulling anything suspect the moment she found it rather than letting it sit even a day. And she noticed, the way she had noticed years before with Thomas, that her thinned rows dried faster after each rain than they used to. The lower leaves and fruit clusters shedding water and drying out within an hour or two of the sun showing itself, were in past wet seasons before she'd opened the canopy properly. The same spots would have stayed damp for half a day or more. Word reached her, secondhand through a neighbor stopping by for eggs, that David's orchard, despite 2 fungicide passes, was starting to show trouble in patches, mostly in the older, denser part of his acreage where the spray truck's mist hadn't fully penetrated the thick canopy to reach fruit clustered deep inside, and that he'd had his crew out picking and discarding rotted fruit by hand for 2 straight days. The same unglamorous work Maggie had done a week earlier, only now done in a panic, rather than ahead of time. When the weather finally broke on the 10th day, the sky clearing to a hard, bright blue that felt almost like an apology, the cooperative sent its grader around to the orchards in the district to assess the crop before harvest crews were scheduled. A quiet, thorough man named Pruitt who had done the job for the co-op for 11 years and had no patience for exaggeration in either direction. He walked Maggie's rows slowly, checking clusters at random through each block, and found rot. Because there is no method in farming that promises a clean sweep against a fungus that lives on wind and rain, and Maggie's oldest, hardest to reach corner near the fence line, the one she hadn't finished pruning until the very last hour before the rain came, showed a noticeable patch of spoiled fruit she would have to pick and cull before the fresh market harvest began. But it was contained to that one corner, a fraction of the crop, and the rest of her acreage. The blocks she'd opened up properly days ahead of the rain showed remarkably little damage for a season that had just delivered 9 straight days of the exact conditions brown rot needed to spread. Pruitt said as much himself, plainly, The way a man who has walked 100 orchards that same wet season says it. That her fruit looked better than most of what he'd seen that week. Better, in fact, than some of the sprayed orchards where the canopy had stayed too thick for the chemical or the sun to do much good. David Reese heard the comparison before the day was out, the way news traveled fast in a place the size of Briar Creek, and he drove down to Maggie's place that evening, not to argue but to see for himself, walking her rows with his hands in his pockets and his earlier confidence a good deal quieter than it had been at the feed store. He asked her, plainly, how she'd known, and Maggie told him the truth, that she hadn't known for certain, not the way a person knows a fact from a book, but that she and Thomas had watched wet trees and dry trees side by side for enough seasons to trust that air moving through a canopy mattered more than most growers gave it credit for, and that a fungicide could only do its job where the mist actually reached, which wasn't always as far into a dense tree as a person hoped. David didn't have much to say to that beyond admitting, with a rueful kind of laugh very different from the one at the feed store 2 weeks earlier, that he'd have to think about opening up his own older blocks before next season, and that he owed her an apology for the joke about asking the clouds nicely. Maggie told him there was nothing to apologize for, that she'd have laughed too in his position, and the two of them stood a while longer at the edge of the orchard watching the last of the evening light catch on the ripening cherries, most of them whole and firm and ready for picking within the week. In the days that followed, as harvest crews moved through Briar Creek and the co-op trucks made their rounds, Maggie found herself, almost without meaning to, teaching the technique to a neighbor's teenage son who'd been hired on to help with her picking crew, showing him which limbs to watch for the following winter, which water sprouts to cut before they thickened into problems, and why clearing fallen fruit mattered as much as any pruning cut. She had not set out to pass anything along, not the way some families kept a notebook or a story for that purpose. But she found, watching the boy nod along and ask good questions, that it mattered to her all the same that the orchard would be a little better tended after her than it had been before, whether or not it was her own blood who carried the habit forward. The fresh market check that came from the cooperative that August was not the largest Maggie had ever received, because no season with 9 days of wet weather during ripening was going to produce a flawless crop, and the corner near the fence line still cost her a portion of what it might have earned in a drier year. But it was a strong check all the same, strong enough to carry her comfortably through the winter, and stronger by a fair margin than what several of her sprayed neighbors brought in that same season. Once the cost of the fungicide and the contractor's fee was weighed against what their rot-thinned harvests actually paid. What Maggie had leaned on that June was not a secret and not a miracle, and it would not have saved every orchard in every kind of wet season, a fact she would have been the first to admit, because a bad enough stretch of rain, wet enough and long enough, could still overwhelm even a properly pruned canopy, and pruning alone was never going to replace good judgment about when to spray in years when the disease pressure ran especially high. What it came down to, in the end, was something plainer than a secret, the simple, well-documented fact that the fungus behind brown rot in stone fruit thrives on moisture that lingers, and that a canopy opened to let in light and air will dry out faster after rain than one grown thick and shaded, giving the fungus less time to take hold before conditions turn dry again. A principal regional agricultural extension offices across the Midwest had documented for decades in growers' bulletins, alongside the equally well-established value of removing fallen or infected fruit promptly so it cannot seed the next wet spell. It was not a substitute for every other tool a grower might reasonably use, and it worked best paired with good judgment about timing and weather rather than used alone as a cure-all. But it was real, it was free apart from the sweat of doing it, and it had carried a widow and her cherry trees through one more wet June the same quiet way it had carried her and her husband through the ones before it. Years later, growers in Briar Creek who remembered that wet June still told it, as the season the widow Calder pruned her way through a rot year that hurt half the county, though Maggie herself, if anyone asked, was quick to say it hadn't been any single clever idea on her part, only a habit two people had built together over a great many ordinary seasons, tested at last by a summer that gave the habit no room to hide whether it was worth keeping. The boy she'd taught that August went on, in the years after, to run pruning crews of his own around the county, and he was known to tell newer growers, half in jest and half in earnest, that the fastest way to lose an argument with him about spraying versus pruning was to ask what Maggie Calder would do, a small, ordinary kind of legacy that neither of them had planned for, and both of them, in their own quiet ways, seemed glad to carry.